Hi everyone. Today we're going to take a look at our notes on JavaScript objects, methods, and properties, and then we're going to take a look at our Internet Interview program and give it a little bit of functionality. So let's take a look. And what is an object? This is a JavaScript data type that has methods and properties. And so there's two main objects we're going to talk about today. There is the string object and the number object. Okay. For example, it says we often use methods and properties of the string object in JavaScript. So when we make a variable, right, we're going to call it Kenobi string. We're going to make it equal to, quote, use the force Luke, right? So putting it in those quotation marks, right, we're telling the program, hey, the data type for this variable is a string. Well, because we know it's a string in JavaScript, we can now use certain methods. Remember, that's a fancy word for function, right? And those strings have certain properties or attributes in JavaScript that we can apply in our code. For example, Kenobi string, again, we know it's a string data type. Well, that means it has a property called .length. And .length tells us exactly how many characters are in that string. So use is 3, space 4, the 7, space 8, force is 5 more, 13, comma is 14, space is 15, Luke gets us to 19, and then period is the 20th character in that string, right? So Kenobi string.length has a value of 20. We can save that number to a variable. We could use it. We could put it in a window.alert, right? We could put it into a divs in our HTML. We can do whatever we want with it, right? But .length is a specific property that we're going to use for string objects, okay? Now, there are specific methods. So again, that's a fancy word for function for strings as well. For example, there is .toUpperCase. What the toUpperCase function does is it'll take whatever string you have, which is in this case Kenobi string, and it will take every character in there and make it an uppercase letter. Obviously, we can't do anything with spaces and punctuation, so those stay the same. And now Kenobi string .toUpperCase, open close parentheses, is, quote, use the force Luke, all uppercase letters, right? We could now save that to its own variable like Kenobi yell. Okay, so these are just some examples of one method for the string object, one property for the string object in JavaScript, right? Let's do the same thing for the number object in JavaScript. Let's say we have a variable which is going to be used to approximate pi. So floating point number, or just a float, right? For JavaScript, they just call it a number. Okay, it doesn't matter if it's a float or an integer, right? A number is a number. Okay, so one of the methods we can use for numbers, so again, my variable here is called pi_approx, right, is the method called toString, open close parentheses. And what that will do is it will turn it into, quote, 3.14159, end quote. Okay, why would I want this as a string? Well, maybe now I can concatenate it into a larger string, right? I can come up with a larger string that I want to then maybe display on the screen, for example, right? And I want this number to be a part of that. So the .toString function is good for that, okay? Another method specific for number objects is for rounding. It is the .toFixed, right? So pi_approx.toFixed, and in parentheses, whatever your argument is how many decimal places it will round pi_approx to. So pi_approx.toFixed2 will turn it into 3.14, and then you could save that to its own variable. Okay, and so the last slide just has a W3 Schools link to take a look at these. I have both of these tabs open. So the first one is for string methods, right? So what are some methods specifically for the string function, right? So you can take a look at these. There's a few of these we're going to use throughout the year. Character at, character code at, toUpperCase, toLowerCase. Those are just some of the ones we use quite a bit in this class, okay? Number methods, we can take a look, right? toFixed is probably the one we're going to use the most Okay, and then there's examples for all these you can take a look at. All right, so that's it for the notes. Let's go back to our internet interview, and we finished up part 1, which turned our internet interview to look something like this. Okay, there was one thing I mentioned in the last video that we did not do though, which is a little bit of styling, just to kind of make it look like the description, right? The sample output, right? It has everything centered. Okay, so just one quick styling thing for ours, so that we can go ahead and center everything. So I'm going to go in my head tag after the title, right? I'm going to put style, okay? And for the entire body of my page, I'm going to align everything to the center of the screen. So it is called text align. So TE, and you can see it comes up right away, right? It's the second option. So I'm going to hit enter. And now it gives you some options for this styling, right? We're going to pick center. Okay, and that's it. So I'm going to save it, go back, refresh, and now everything is centered on my web page. Okay, now let's say you didn't want one part of this centered, right? You could then say, oh, I want my H1 tag still aligned left, right? You could add specific styling that would then align specific tags however you wanted them, or style however you want them to. Okay. Okay. So that's all the styling for today. So let's take a look at part 2, website functionality. Add an on-click attribute to your button that runs a function named submit response. So I think I showed you this last time. I think this was already in my code. So my button down at the bottom, I wrote submit responses. I'm going to get rid of that extra S, just so that we're going along with what is on the handout. So it is just submit response. Okay, so that was the first bullet point. All right, in this function, first collect all users' inputs one by one and store each in its own variable. Okay, so if we go back to our page, right, I'm going to refresh again, even though we didn't change anything. I have 3 text boxes, right, 3 places where I'm gathering input from the user, right? What is their first name? Right? What is their last name? And what year they first accessed the internet. Okay, I want to take all of these and I want to save them, right, when I click this submit button. Okay, so that all then has to happen in my submit response function. So let's scroll up back to my head tag. Okay, after the style, I'm going to make a script tag. Okay, and in that script tag, I'm going to define a function. Okay, right? I'm going to start off with a comment though, okay, before we define a function. All right, so what is the purpose of the function that I'm going to make, right? So I can say that the purpose is to, you know, grab all user input and display an appropriate output string. Yeah, I couldn't think of anything to say. Okay, we'll leave it like that. All right, so let's make a function. I'm going to call it submit, and love VS Code. I already typed in submit response earlier, so it's like, hey, are you looking for this? Yes, I am. Open close parentheses, open curly bracket. Okay, so the first thing I need to do now is I need to grab the values of my 3 text boxes, and so they all have separate IDs, IDF name, IDL name, ID year, right? So let's go ahead and grab the value for all those text boxes. Okay, so I'm going to make a variable, so let's, and I'll call it first name equal, in this document, get element by ID. The ID is IDF name, and I want the value. Okay, now before I go any further, I see I made a typo. I wanted to write first name. I wrote FIRS. That's the type of thing where it won't give you an error in the program, but if I later on spelled it correctly, it would not work because I had misspelled it earlier. So let's keep going. I'll make a variable called last name, and I'll do the same thing. Document.getElement by ID, quote IDL name, dot value. Whoops, I hit caps lock, value. And let's make another one, and I'll call it year equals document dot get element by ID. And it was it just ID year, right? Does that sound right? Yes, it was just ID year, capital Y. So we'll go ID year dot value. Okay, so I'm gonna use these three, right, when I go ahead and try to concatenate and make my nice output string, okay? But I know I'm gonna need those three, okay? So that's that bullet point done. Now, the second bullet point says count how many checkboxes the user has chosen by utilizing an if statement for each one. The helpful hint here says you will need a counter variable that begins at 0 and increases by 1 each time a checked box is found. This is an important idea for us, is the idea of creating a counter variable, right? If I want to keep track of how many times something is happening on my web page, right? It doesn't matter what the thing is, right? But I need a variable that I can update, right, whenever that thing happens, right? So each time I click one of these checkboxes, right, I want it to count how many checkboxes have been clicked on, right, when I run this function by clicking the button at the bottom. Okay, so let's go ahead and make a counter variable. All right, and I'll say let, we can call it a lot of things. I'll call it num checked. And I'm going to make it equal to a number, and I'm going to start off by making it equal to 0. Okay, and now I always like to put a few blank lines, by the way, space out your code. These lines don't cost you anything. Okay, now I need to go through each of my checkboxes, right? Because on my web page, how many do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I have 9 checkboxes, right? So I need to see if each of these has been checked, right? And so real quick, if we go back to yesterday's notes on handling web page data, right? We talked about how our checkboxes have an attribute called .checked, right? Oops, I'm sorry. And it will give us either a true or a false if this box with this ID, right, whether it is currently checked or not. Okay, so this is going to give us a true or false. I'm going to write something like this directly into an if statement. Now, if I go back to my code, remember that when we created all of our checkboxes, we gave each of them a unique ID, right? Which is very important because this first checkbox has a completely different option than the second checkbox, right? So again, make sure your IDs are unique. I like to use a similar pattern when naming IDs, right? But, they do have to be unique somehow. In this case, the numbering system is fine, right? If I have so many of these things, 1 through 9 is an easy way to do it. Okay, so in my code here, I'm going to say if my first checkbox, so I need to identify it first. So document.getElement by ID, quote, ID option 1, I believe is what we called it, right? I'm going to scroll back and just double check. Yep. ID option 1 is my first ID. Okay. If this element, so again, when I run this code, right, the browser knows, okay, in this file, there is only one element with this ID, right? What about it? What about that element? Well, I want to see its .checked property. Okay, and now again, just like in yesterday's notes, the .checked property will tell us whether this is true or false, whether this specific checkbox, the one with this ID, has been selected or not. Okay, I'm going to go curly bracket, hit enter. Now, if this is, pardon me, if this is true, what should I do? I should add one to my counter variable num checked. So I'm going to write num checked, and now there's a lot of ways of doing this, right? You could say num checked equals what num checked previously was plus 1. That would work. You could also do the shorthand and say num checked plus equals 1. That would also work. But remember, there's an even shorter way to specifically add or subtract one, right? And that is the plus plus. Okay, so if this is true, we will add one to num checked. Okay, now I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to say else, and I'm going to put a space, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy my if, and I'm going to paste it here, and I'm just going to update ID option to 2. And now I'm going to copy the whole else if, I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to paste, and I'm going to change it to ID option 3. Okay, and now I'm just going to keep on doing that, right? ID option 4, click here, hit enter, paste again, make that a 5, click there, hit enter, paste again. As I'm doing this, some of you might be noticing that I have made an error, and I've made it intentionally. Okay, it is not a typo. I have not typed anything that the program won't be able to do. I have made what might be the worst kind of error, a logical error. And we'll talk about what that logical error is at the end. Okay, but this is what we're going to do for now. All right, so this will check, right, all of my checkboxes, right? Again, if this is true, right, we will add one to num checked. Okay, all right. Okay, so let's go back to the description. Okay, so we took care of the counter variable. Now it says create a variable named internet impact and set it to an empty string. Using if statements, change internet impact to be low if the user has checked between 0 and 2 boxes, fair if it's 3 to 5 boxes, or high for 6 or more boxes. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. All right, so after the else if here, I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to make a variable called, I've already forgotten, what is it called? Internet impact. There we go. Internet impact. I'm going to make it equal to the empty string. And I'm going to do a new set of ifs. I'm going to say if, right, my number checked. Now the first option said if it's between 0 and 2, right? So we know it starts off as 0, so I don't have to worry about that. So I can just say something like this, right? If it's less than or equal to 2. Okay, if num checked is less than or equal to 2, curly bracket, right, then I will say that internet impact. Now, I'm not concatenating here, right? I am not going plus equals because I'm not adding on to this string. I'm going to replace it with an entirely new string. So I'm going to go equals low. Okay. Okay, that's if num checked was less than or equal to 2. Otherwise, so else if num checked, and you can do this a few different ways, but if it's between 3 and 5, right? So I can do something similar, right? I can say if num checked is less than or equal to 5. Okay, now some of you are going to be like, wait a second, what if they only checked one box? Isn't that less than or equal to 5? Remember, that's why we're going if else, right? If the number checked is just 1, right, then this is the only code that's going to run. We're going to skip everything that's part of the else. So we can do something like this. If you don't like this, you could say less than 6, right? That works as well. We're only dealing with integers for num checked. So for us, there's no difference between saying less than or equal to 5 or less than 6. A lot of students make this overly complicated, and I want to show you what that looks like and why it's not needed. They like to say, okay, if it's greater than or equal to 3 and num checked is less than or equal to 5. There's nothing wrong with this, right? This is just two different conditions in one if statement, okay? But again, because we're doing an if else, right, we don't have to worry about the lower bound of this, right? Because if number checked is 0, 1, or 2, this if is going to run. Whatever we do with the else is not going to happen, okay? That's why I think this is just kind of excessive, right? So I would just get rid of that first part and just keep it something like this. Okay, so curly bracket, and now internet impact is going to be, what was it medium, right? Fair. It was fair. Okay, fair. All right. Oh, and by the way, I should put some semicolons, just some best practice there. Okay, and now what's the only other option? Well, it's either going to be 6, 7, 8, or 9. I'm just going to go else internet impact is going to be quote high, close quote, semicolon. Okay. Okay, so let's do one more step here, or sorry, 2 steps, then we'll kind of do everything together. Okay, create a variable named years on internet and set it to the difference between the user's input year and the current year. Now, I want to talk about the current year first, okay? And I want to bring up an idea. We talked about this way back in our variable notes, the idea of a constant, okay? So before the script tag, right? Or sorry, not before it, before the function submit response, but still in the script tag, okay? And this is something we'll talk about more later on, all right? I'm going to add another comment, and I'm going to say, here are all of my global variables. Okay, put a little gap there, and I'll kind of go back up to this line. All right, so if I have something that I know is not going to change, right, instead of writing just let, I'm going to write const, C-O-N-S-T. Okay, and I'm going to call it all caps current, I'll go underscore year. Okay, I'm going to make it equal to, what's our current year? 2024. Okay, something like this is good to do, right? So there's a couple things here, but first I want to talk about the constant part of this. So constant, right, meaning that I can't change this in my code, right? Because the year is not changing for several months still, right? We're not that close to the end of the year yet. We have a few full months left to go, right? So it's good to do something like this. And now if you think about it from a programmer's perspective, right? Okay, 2025 comes, right? Do you want to have to scroll down in this code and see where you put the number 2024 and then update it? Or you can just see it at the very top of your script and go, oh, right here, I'm just going to, boom, change that to a 5, right? Because everywhere in my code, I didn't use a number. I just used the variable, right? Sorry, I know I'm saying variable. That's just what we call, right, what we're using here. But it's a constant because it's not going to change anywhere in the code. Okay, so we can just do this at the top and then we're ready, right? I can update this easily for all future years that I have to do this. Okay, why did I put this in the script tag but not in the function, right? This is what we call a global variable. Okay, we're not going to deal with it much today, but the only thing we really have to know right now is that if I wanted to use current year in this function submit response and some other function that I make in this script tag, right, I could use it in all of those functions. So I don't have to write let current year in this function. It would apply to all of the functions I make in this script tag. So again, global variables we'll talk more about later on. Okay, for now we're good with just the one. All right, so create a variable named years on the internet, set it to the difference between the user's input year and the current year. So let's go ahead and make that variable. Okay, so after this else, I'm going to go let years on internet equal the difference between the current year. So I'm going to type capital C, and right there, it's the first thing that shows up. I'm going to hit enter, minus, what did we call the variable that we got from this text box, right? Because we already took care of that. Let's go back to the top of my function, and we just called it lowercase year. Okay, so we'll just do a little bit of math here, right? and that will just be right there. That'll tell us how many years, right, the difference is, right, of those two numbers. Okay, now before we move on, again, I'm hoping you've noticed something. I have made a mistake. This one I'm going to fix right now. Okay, right, if I scroll back to the top, my year variable is the value from the input text box. We've talked about this a few times. Remember, this is going to be a string data type, right? I want to do some math with this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put all of this inside of a parse int. Parse capital INT parentheses, and before the semicolon, I will put another parentheses. Okay. All right. So again, I want to make sure that this is now going to be a number. And when I put my mouse over the variable name year, do you see how it says number right there? If I do that for first name or last name, it says any, right? Because technically it could turn into any data type, right? But more importantly, we know that when we do it from a text box, it's going to be a string, right? And so we don't want it to be a string. We specifically want it to be a number, right? And so that's what we'll do here with parse int around all of this. Okay. All right. So that was the year variable, right? And so boom, that's right there. Okay. So that's that step done. All right. So we already did that. Create a variable named text length that holds how many characters the user typed in the text area. So we just did this, right, based on the notes we did, right, for, you know, the number, right, we used parse float, right, parse int, we talked about yesterday's notes, right, but again, for strings, we can use something called .length. So let's go ahead and do that now, okay. So my text area down here has an ID of ID text area. Now, folks, just, you know, I should have said this earlier. If you're using different IDs than me, right, you got to make sure you're writing down your IDs in the JavaScript function you're making, because otherwise it's just not going to work, right? Double check your IDs. I'm always double checking my IDs, right? This, you know, all the text boxes, all the check boxes, all of that stuff. If you don't have the same ID as me, you're going to get errors, right? So either go with your IDs or go with mine, but either way, just be consistent. ID text area is mine. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and count off, right, how many characters they wrote. So after I make this variable years on the internet, right, I'll say this variable should be called text count. Okay, and I'll say that document.getElementById, ID text area dot length. Okay, now this is not going to work right away, okay, because I've done something here I should not have, right? Remember, .length is only for the string, right? So first, what I need to do is I need to get the value for the text area. So I should go .value, okay? So I'm not using the length yet, okay, right? I'm not using the length yet. I'm just going to go .value. And actually, you know what? Let me change this up a little bit. Instead of calling this text count, right, what are we asking the user to do in that text area? They're asking their experience with the internet, right? So why don't we call it, instead of text count, right, let's call it text exp, right? Because this is the text for them telling us what their experience with the internet was. And now immediately after this, just like in the notes, I'll make another variable. This one I'm going to call text count, and I'm going to make it, right, whatever the value from the text area was, so that will be a string. This is where I want the length, okay? I want it to be the length of that. All right, so sorry about that. I wanted to change it up a little bit from what I had prior. Okay. Okay, So let's keep going. Now, finally, we are ready. Create a variable that holds an output sentence utilizing the user's first name, last name, years on the internet, length of their input in the text area, right? Number of checkboxes and their internet impact similar to this. Hello, Mark Langer. You have been on the internet for 20 years. Your response has 57 characters in it, and you checked off 7 items. This indicates the internet has had a high impact on your life. Okay, so let's go ahead and set something up like that. So I'm going to make a variable. I'm going to call it output. And I'm going to start off by letting output be a string that says hello, comma, space, and I'll stop it right there. Okay, and now I'm going to add on to this my variables with the user's first name. So I'm concatenating my strings. So output currently has a string. I'm going to add on to that string, right? What did we call my variables here? We called it first name, last name. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so first name plus last name. And now, so again, some of you might be like, you've made an error. That is on purpose for now. We'll come back and talk about that. Plus, quote, period. I'm going to put a space in the quotes. And I'm going to put a semicolon. Okay, let's go back to the description, right? Oh, actually, instead of a period, we'll change it to a comma. You have been on the internet for blank years. Okay, so change that period to a comma, right? We can stop that line here, keep going. Output plus equals, quote, you have been on the internet for, so what is my variable for that? It is years on internet. So years on internet, colon, output plus equals, quote, space, years, period. Okay, let's keep going. Your response has the number of characters in it, and you checked off 7 items. Okay, so we'll go years, right? And you know, I'm doing some of this on new lines of code. I'm doing output plus equals, right? You can kind of make these into fewer lines. I just don't like going too far to the right. That's the one thing I want to avoid, because then I can't see what I've done previously. Okay, so I will go quote space, you have, oh no, we already did that. Your response has space, quote, plus, so what is the count on my number of characters? It is text count, right? So it is text count plus space characters in it, period. Actually, no, I think we're going to stop. In it, comma, and you checked off 7 items. In it, comma, space, close quote there, and then semicolon. So output, and you can see right away I'm not happy about this. So how about I get rid of this? Let's get rid of it. Let's just say characters space, and I'll go output plus equals in it, and you checked off space quote plus. So what was my variable that's counting how many I checked? It was just num checked, right? Num checked. Okay. Num checked items. This indicates the internet has had a, okay, num checked, output plus equals, items. This indicates, and we'll put the S in parentheses there. This indicates that the internet has had a, space there, has had a, let's see, It has had a, and now this is where we write the internet impact on your life. Okay, so what did we call that variable? That was internet impact. Internet impact plus on your life. Oh, sorry, I should write internet impact is the variable. I need the word impact to show up. High, because it's low, fair, high impact on your life, period. Okay, so this is one way to do it. Again, you can kind of combine stuff into fewer lines of code, right? But the overall idea here is we are concatenating. We have one string of characters and we're adding on to it all of these other strings of characters. And you can keep adding on and all of it is saved into this one variable output. And so the last thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to take output and I'm going to put it into the inner HTML of my div tag. So it says use unique id.innerHTML equals variable name. So after I'm done concatenating, I'm going to go document.getElementById, and I think we called it id div output, but we'll double check that. Divs have inner HTML, and I'm going to make it equal to my output variable. So I'm just going to double click on this div ID here. I'm going to scroll all the way down, and yep, we did indeed call it id div output, right? So the inner HTML for this div is currently empty. We're going to take the contents of our variable called output, and we're going to put it all right here into the inner HTML. Okay, so that's what we're doing with this last line. All right. Okay, so again, there's a couple errors I've made here on purpose, right? So there's a couple things here that we're going to come back and change as well. Let's go ahead and take a look at what we've got and see how it works so far. Okay, so basic information, first name is students, last name is students. I'm very creative. First year access to the internet was 1997. Briefly describe what you first remember. A lot of weird dial-up sounds. And if you don't know what dial-up is, just consider yourself lucky. Okay. And I'm going to click a whole bunch of these boxes. We'll do 5 of them. And when I click submit, right, I'm going to just make this a little larger so you guys can see this at the bottom. Hello, and right away, you'll see one of my mistakes. Okay. Hello, students, right? What happened here? I did not put a space in between those characters, right? So you have to be careful, right? Space is something, you'll notice I put it sometimes in my string. Here I did not. So before I add last name to first name, I should first add a string with a space in it. There we go, right? So be careful. This is not an empty string. The one I've highlighted here on mine on line 70, this is not an empty string because the space character is inside of here, okay? And you'll notice in a couple of other spots too, I put in a few extra spaces. So like after the word characters here, I put a space at the end of that string. I put another space at the start of in it. So I could probably delete that one, okay? And I think that's the only other one I did there, all right? But let's go back and take a look at our output. I have been on the internet for 27 years. That's a scarily large number. Your response has 30 characters in it, and you checked off, uh-oh. And here's my logic error in play. I checked off 1 item? No, I didn't. I checked off 5 items. How come it didn't register? This indicates the internet has had a low impact. What? It should be bigger than low, right? Again, I checked off 5 items. So what's happening here? Let's scroll up to that part of our code, right? And let's see if we can think about why it's only saying I checked off 1 item, okay? This is a good place to pause the video if you want to talk it out with the people around you. Okay, so what's the error though? The error is if, else, if. That's the error, right? Because the way this is being interpreted is that if the first checkbox is true, I'm not running the code to check any of these other checkboxes. Okay, so what we're doing here, right, is we're only seeing if one of them is true. So at most, num checked is ever going to be is 1, right? Let's say it's the third checkbox, right? So this one was false, this one was false. I add 1 to num checked, and now I'm never going to check the rest of these else ifs. So the fix for this is easy, right? We're just going to get rid of all of these else's, and we're going to make them all individual ifs. Okay, and the reason, again, we're doing that is so now that these ifs are not connected to each other, and so if one of them is true, it does not stop us from checking all of the other ones. So let's go ahead and try it again. Let's refresh. Ooh, that's real zoomed in. Okay, my name is Victor Viking, and 1997. And I'll say getting yelled at by my parents to get offline so they could use the phone. Again, if you don't know these struggles, consider yourself lucky. Okay, and I'll do 5 again. And let's hit submit. And if I scroll down and look at this, now it's correctly counting that I've checked off 5 items, and the internet has had a fair impact on your life. Okay, and by the way, it doesn't hurt to quickly just uncheck a few and hit submit, right? Oh, I have 3 selected, sorry. There we go. I have 2 now, and low works. And let me do a bunch more. And now 7, and it does update to high. Okay. Okay, and that is it. That is everything we had to do for this part of the internet interview. Okay, so kind of the biggest things I want you to take away from today's part is the concatenating. That's a huge component of it. Okay, right? And then using the properties for certain objects like the dot checked and the dot length. Those were big parts as well. Okay, so I think that's it for now. We'll call it right there. Okay, that's the end of part 2, and I'll see you next time.